I would like to begin by lighting our chalice. Of course, that would happen with the following words. Oh. If we believe that all people have inherent worth and dignity, then we believe all bodies have inherent worth and dignity. Every body is a blessing, bringing the world to life through hearing, scent, tasting, touch, and sight. If we believe that all bodies have inherent worth and dignity, we also believe that caring for one another is a moral responsibility. Remembering that things happen to people between the womb and the grave, we are reminded that most people will experience some form of disability at some point in their lives. We light this chalice for the vision of a world where all people, no matter what their abilities or disabilities, have access to what they need to live a full and purposeful life. All our relations.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you. So we have three speakers with us. I'd like to introduce you to them, and I'll say a little bit about each of the three, and then they, as they speak, will pass to the next. For Kate Chung, who I think probably all of you on this call may know. Kate is a member of CUSJ, Canadian Unitarians for Social Justice. She graduated with an MA in sociology from the University of Toronto and worked for many years in social services. In retirement, she now volunteers as co-chair of the Accessible Housing Network, which is a nonpartisan network of organizations working to support the human rights of persons with disabilities and end the extreme lack of accessible housing. Then we'll hear from Tracy Odell. Tracy spent her childhood in an institution for children with disabilities. She has an MA in critical disability studies from York University. Now retired from a career in the public service, she is president of Citizens with Disabilities Ontario. And then Thea Curdy is president of Designable Environments, Inc., one of Canada's oldest and leading accessibility and universal design consulting firms for the built environment. She lectures at post-secondary programs and speaks worldwide about how sustainable, responsible, and integral accessibility is to successful architecture. Thank you so much. Over to you, Kate.
Right, I think I'm unmuted now. Thanks to CUSJ for inviting us today, and thank you for passing the AGM resolution in support of our call for all new apartments to be required to be universal design, and for following up with letters to the Prime Minister and federal ministers. This is so important for raising awareness among politicians. And thank you to everybody who's here joining us today. This is a bigger crowd than we expected. It's important for individuals to continue writing to all of our political representatives, whether municipal, provincial, or federal, and also to the media. Every letter is assumed to represent another 100 people who feel the same way you do. So please know your letter is extremely important. Phone calls too. Your interest and concern about the crisis in accessible housing is encouraging and helpful to all of us who are working to bring change. After all, we're all just temporarily abled. If we're not already experiencing a disability, we're one accident, illness, or old age away from some kind of disability, whether temporary or permanent. So the accessibility and housing issue affects every one of us. My awareness came about 35 years ago when I lived in a co-op where there were just a few units that were accessible. There was a little girl who used an electric wheelchair. She was about 8 years old. And in good weather, you'd see her outside circling around on the driveway with some of the other kids. But the rest of the year, she couldn't play with any of them because there were steps at the front and back of all the other townhouses. So I vowed that someday I'd do something about this injustice. Despite the fact that roughly a quarter of Canadians have a disability, there's still no law in Canada requiring that any housing be accessible. In Ontario, the building code only requires that 15% of new apartments be visitable, not accessible enough to live there. And the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, doesn't even mention housing. The Human Rights Code takes precedence over all other laws, including the building code. But all governments ignore this. They break their own law. The Accessible Housing Network is calling for national and provincial building codes to be changed to require that every unit in all new apartment and condo buildings be universal design, so anybody of any age or ability can live there. And this means too that if you have a heart attack or a stroke or get hit by a truck, you don't lose your home. We know that the benefits of accessible housing include reduced costs for long-term care. Many people would be able to remain in their accessible homes. Protection of seniors and persons with disabilities, like the catastrophes we've seen during COVID. Reduced need for in-home help. Improved mental and physical health. Fewer falls, fewer ambulance calls, fewer hospitalizations, and increased employment of people with disabilities. So we're calling on every candidate in the coming Ontario election to sign our pledge that if elected, they'll change the building code. If you want to have a copy of the pledge to take to your candidates in your riding, just send us an email, accessiblehousing.network@gmail.com. We need everybody to go after all the candidates in their ridings in this election. Otherwise, we'll be ignored. No tax dollars should ever create accessibility barriers. And now I hand the spotlight over to Tracy.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you for the introduction that I have been provided with already. I'm very pleased to be here to meet with you today, and just in a nutshell, to tell you a bit about my housing story. So I was born over 60 years ago, and by the time I was 2, and I was not walking, it was discovered that I had a condition called spinal muscular atrophy, had a different name back then, probably easier for me to pronounce, SMA for short, which is a type of muscular dystrophy. So because of that disability, I was always going to need help with various things. I couldn't walk, so obviously, you know, getting around from place to place was going to be a challenge. We couldn't afford wheelchairs, so you know, I had to be carried everywhere, and you know, needing help with everyday ordinary things like, you know, getting up, getting washed, having a bath, whatever. So by the time I was 7, it was suggested to my parents that myself and my sister, who also had the same disability, go to live in an institution in Toronto. It was like a hospital. My parents kind of considered it more like a boarding school, but it was a hospital. And I went to live there. And then as it was a children's hospital. So by the time you were 18, you were supposed to like leave, either leave and look after yourself if you were physically able to do that. And if you couldn't, like in my situation, the idea was that I would be moved into a nursing home, or, you know, my roommate would be someone with, you know, 90 years old or whatever. At the age of 18, I did not want to share a room with anybody who did not like the same music that I wanted to listen to as loud as I would like to have listened to it at the time. But, you know, it was not part of my wish or my vision for myself as an adult to just be moved to, you know, a nursing home basically, and to live the rest of my life there. At the same time, we were starting to see demonstration projects coming up around the province, and they were for people to be able to live in the community who needed physical help. And that being including people who had been in accidents, who were quadriplegics, for example, people like me with muscular dystrophy and, you know, a variety of other conditions. And the demonstration project that was opening in Toronto had 12 people living there. And there was, by a stroke of luck, there was a vacancy because one of the people who moved in decided it was not for her. So they had a vacancy, and they also had a vacancy for a woman because of the staffing. They were keeping vacancies matching by gender. So at the time I was 18, here was this spot open for me in a demonstration project. I was accepted. It was one of, you know, it was the only spot vacant at the time. When it opened the year before, there was 12 spots to fill in all of Toronto, you know, like a huge city. But that was all. And I was accepted. And that was the beginning of my real life. Like from there, I was able to go to university and do the things that, you know, was mentioned in the introduction. Starting my family, meeting my husband and being married, and, you know, all of those things that help to enrich your life. And now I've got 2 grandchildren as well to show for it. And so even though this is something that happens like over 60 years ago, this is a problem that still persists today. There's been things in that paper around, you know, Montreal, a gentleman there who's been struggling to get out of a nursing home. He set himself up in a cage on Queen's Park, not Queen's Park, sorry, the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, to protest the conditions that he had to live in. In Halifax right now, there's a case coming before the Supreme Court around institutionalization of people with disabilities rather than providing housing in the community. So as a strong proponent of being able to live independently in the community with, you know, and have your own life, and, you know, live your life as you want to live it, as a proponent of that, you know, I just see that that's still a problem. Like people who are ready to leave, say a rehabilitation hospital because they had been injured in an accident, might not have a place where they can go and live independently in the community. People who, you know, have their disabilities all their lives, like me, become adults and they would like to leave home and, you know, strike out on their own many times, and they're prevented from doing so. So, you know, I'm often asked, why are we saying, you know, 100% of the units need to be accessible? Surely we don't want to fill up an apartment building only with people with disabilities, because then we'd be kind of right back at the hospital, like, you know, I started from. But that's not the point. The point is that in that building with maybe, you know, 100 apartments in it or more, if one becomes vacant and it doesn't happen to be one that will work for you with your wheelchair, or it's not suited for you who are blind or deaf with, you know, strobe light fire alarms, then, you know, you have to miss your spot and wait for the next one, right? Like the same with accessible bathrooms. You're there, you're waiting in line, and it's your turn, and then you can't use the washroom because, you know, someone else is using the accessible one, and you have to kind of wait, you know, a few more terms. It's like that with apartments, but the turns that we're waiting are not, you know, a few minutes like a bathroom. They are years. And so to level the playing field and to catch up, we need to have that choice of accessible housing that's suitable for everyone. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it back over to Kate.
Actually, over to Tracy, to Thea now, Thea Curdy.
Okay, I'm just doing a mic check. Can everybody hear me?
Sure can.
Terrific, thank you. All right, I'm sharing my screen. I've got lots of great information, in fact, far too much. So if anybody would like a copy of the presentation, please feel free to contact me. My role here today is to share some good news, some reality check news, but also lots of great news about exactly how to create a situation that's far better, far more equitable. So this presentation is called "What is Adaptable, Visitable, and Universal Design Housing?" My name is Thea Curdy. I'm the president of Designable Environments. And you can, oh, sorry, hang on. Okay, so Designable Environments is an organization, as mentioned at the introduction, which specializes in accessible and universal design for the built environment. So built environment obviously is the only thing for accessibility. Our staff are all architectural or have design backgrounds, including urban planning. Our services include things like drawing reviews, working with renovations and new builds, creating accessibility standards for every level of government and internationally. My favorite part is doing research and education, but the point is that accessibility is the only thing that we do. So our agenda today is quite ambitious. I'm going to do my best to get through all of this. The Canadian accessibility and housing legislation is the first. The second is our international agreements. Third, what exactly do we mean by disability? Fourth, what is adaptable, visitable, and universal housing? Fifth, what are other places in the world doing? 6 examples of housing modifications and universal design to inspire you. And then 7 success stories. So first we'll start with the Canadian accessible housing legislation. So the very first thing that many people are not aware of is that we have the Accessible Canada Act, which passed in 2019. It applies to federally regulated industries, including, of course, anything to do with the federal government, but banks and post offices and the RCMP, things like that. It has 5 goals: the realization of a barrier-free Canada, a culture change, standards development, and proactive compliance and enforcement measures, monitoring and oversight. And it's based very heavily, as it says at the bottom of the screen here, nothing about us without us. It is going to be implemented in partnership with persons with disabilities. So this is a great piece of legislation. The goal is to make Canada accessible by 2040, giving us a 20-year time frame to get everything changed and up to date. But most people don't understand our laws. Now, Kate did a great little introduction there, so some of this is going to be repetitious, but I'm going to step back and I'm going to try to help people understand the framework that was started in 1982, almost 40 years ago now, with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms being changed to recognize people with disabilities as first-class citizens. And second, that our Human Rights Code said the buildings and spaces shall not discriminate against people with disabilities. That many people are surprised to hear that, because most of our legislation, unfortunately, does not align with those policies and laws. And as Kate mentioned, the Human Rights Code, wherever you are, supersedes or is the higher law above your local building code, the national building code, whether it's at the federal level, National Building Code and Accessible Canada Act, or at your province or territory level where you may have a different building code. And many provinces now have accessible acts, which I will show you in a second. I wanted to introduce you to a couple of really important people here. At the federal level, we have the Honorable Carla Qualtrough, who's the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion. We also have a Minister of Housing and Inclusion, the Honorable Ahmed Hussain. So if you're looking to people to reach out to, those are 2 people to keep in mind. We also have the National Housing Strategy, which is a 10-year plan that started a few years ago now to spend $70+ billion creating a new generation of housing in Canada, giving more Canadians a place to call home. Unfortunately, not much is there for accessibility. So what exactly does our National Building Code currently say for housing? Well, for those of you who are geeks like me and like to know what's in the legislation, you'd be looking in the National Building Code under section 3821, which is the accessibility section. And this particular clause is about exceptions to accessibility requirements. The first of these exceptions is about housing. The requirements for this section apply to all buildings except, guess what? detached housing, semi-detached housing, housing with secondary suites, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, row houses, and boarding houses. That's a lot of housing to exclude people from, and certainly not consistent with our legislation. In Ontario, as Kate mentioned, we do have some additional accessible requirements. This again is in 3821 under the title of Areas Requiring Barrier-Free Path of Travel. So notice that when we talk about the 15% of suites have to be visitable, all they're really talking about here specifically initially is the barrier-free path of travel to go to get into the unit, to get into one bedroom, to get into the bathroom, get into the kitchen and living space. It says nothing about the accessibility of those spaces. It does talk about bathrooms a little bit more, but it only says that you have to have a turning space for a small manual wheelchair of at least 1,500 turn circles. So of course, nobody does more than the minimum, right? Unfortunately, this does not actually really create a very visitable or very usable and certainly not accessible housing. So what's being done about it? Well, certainly the profile for accessibility is increasing. We now have 5 different provinces with a dedicated accessibility legislation. Ontario got the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act in 2005, followed thereafter by the Accessible Manitoba Act, and more recently, the Accessible Nova Scotia Act, the Accessible British Columbia Act, and the Accessible Newfoundland Labrador Act, which the last 2 just passed last year. Quebec does have an Accessibility Act, but right now it only focuses on employment. So AODA is the oldest of these pieces of legislation. Is referred to as the AODA. It was meant to make Ontario accessible by 2025. Again, it was passed in 2005, giving us 20 years to try to achieve this. We are now 3 years away. How close do you think we are to making the province accessible? Sadly, there's lots of lessons to learn from what the mistakes that Ontario made that hopefully the other provinces can capitalize on. We have a set of integrated accessibility standards, and these are the how-to or the set of requirements for what you're supposed to be doing under the Act. The first is customer service. The second is information and communication. The third is employment. The fourth is transportation. And the last and only one dedicated to the built environment at this point is the design of public spaces. There are 2 new pieces of standards under development right now, one for education and one for healthcare. But as Kate mentioned before, there is nothing in any of these provincial standards yet about housing. So as we said, there's 2 post-secondary education standard, a K-12 or kindergarten to grade 12 standard, and a healthcare standard under developing. And what's missing, of course, is housing. There are great resources for housing happening. In fact, in British Columbia, which many of you are attending from today, you hopefully are aware that the BC Housing has a design guidelines and construction standards, which does include wheelchair accessible and adaptable dwelling units as a part of the topics. And one of the MLAs, Stephanie Cadeau, who's a person with a mobility disability herself, has been pushing to try to change the building code legislation to include accessibility. She and I have had many conversations. Unfortunately, as we're going to see, the word we see here is wheelchair. So there's a lot of focus on wheelchairs so far. As also mentioned, the importance of acting on legislation is a bit of a liability issue. So we do have to be aware that there are consequences, as we mentioned. The Human Rights Code does have precedence over the minimums defined in the Building Code and the Accessibility Acts. And here we see a case of a BC senior who was unable to get her condo board to actually make any of the accessibility accommodations she reasonably requested. They didn't feel like that was reasonable or required. She took them to the BC Human Rights Code, and they not only found in her favor to require the housing to retrofit to make those changes, but also they have been so horrible to her that they were fined penalties for that mistreatment. So let's have a quick look at our international agreements. So everybody's excited about sustainability. Well, good news. There's accessibility and disability requirements in all of the sustainable design goals, or they're often referred to as SDGs. So we have them in our favor as people are talking about them. We also are one of the signatories from around the world for what's known as the UN's Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Canada originally signed this in 2010, and then we signed the optional protocol, which gives the UN oversight rights to make sure that we're implementing the convention in 2018. Those commitments also include housing. The UN also has a Department of Economic and Social Affairs for Disabilities that has this is where the CRPD lives. So there's a website here that I'm showing on the screen that you can, if you do a Google search, you'd be able to find everything about the CRPD. Unfortunately, one of our commitments is about housing. This is a gentleman, Roger P. Gervais, and there's other people involved who've been bringing forward a case to the UN to complain that we have not yet met our commitments to housing by fixing our building code legislation, as we saw. So back to our agenda, item number 3, what is a disability? So let's first have a look at statistics. If we just looked at Ontario, which has some of the largest population here, and I don't mean to be Ontario specific, but just to have a look at the numbers here, if the population in 2018 was 14.32 million people, 22%, 24%, depends on who you talk to. 24% is the newer number, but this is looking at if 22% of the population are self-identifying as having at least one type of disability, then that means that there's 3.15 million people that report having a disability and benefit from accommodations. In the city of Ottawa, and if we looked at their population from 2017, if we just thought about it, like what would 1% of that be? Well, that would be about 10,000 people who would benefit from accommodations or people with disabilities. 10% would be almost 100,000 people with disabilities. But at 22%, you're looking at over 218,000, almost 220,000 people with disabilities who need to have housing. And currently, as we saw, our building code doesn't achieve that. By 2030, Ontarians with over the age of 65 will be a larger percentage of the population than those under the age of 14. In almost every jurisdiction. Right now, we already know that we hit in 2017, 65 and older in certain pockets. So we're seeing a definite shift in our demographics. Another good argument to have with people about justifying, of course, this makes more sense and is more responsible, is that if you thought about the life cycle cost of the house, not just what it costs to build, but life cycle costing is a term we use in green design all the time. And I'll quickly point out there are 4 things that are really important for us to think about. Life cycle is about the importance of the economic analysis of running the building, not just, and maintaining the building, not just building it. 2, using the selection of alternatives that impact both pending and future costs. Comparing initial investment options is the 3rd. And 4th, identifies the least cost alternative for at least a 20-year period. So again, if you were thinking about what if my needs change, what if my family needs changed, and what if my friends' needs changed, what would be a smart investment? So now let's have a quick look at what is a disability. So here on the screen, I'm showing you the international symbol of access, which is a person sitting in the wheelchair on the left with a blue background. On the right-hand side, blue background, white symbol is the forward movement or the active symbol of access that we're now seeing in many municipalities. This is a pretty good symbol for people who are wheelchair users, but it doesn't include people with vision loss, hearing loss, people who are deaf, autistic, amputees, people with multiple chemical sensitivities or environmental sensitivities, people with neurodevelopmental disabilities, or people who are neurodivergent. Certainly doesn't include people with guide or service animals, people with scooters. In fact, there's a whole range here shown at the bottom here of international symbols, including captioning, hearing loss, cognitive disabilities, interpreters, white cane, braille, and closed captioning. So back to our agenda, item number 4, let's get to the meat of this. What exactly is adaptable, visitable, and universal housing? What should we be aiming for? So let's talk about some definitions. Visitable housing includes an entrance that is level, so you don't have to get through steps to get to it. Your patio, perhaps the back, or if you're an apartment, so your patio, exterior patio, it also is level, no step. Number 3, the wider doors on the main floor. Number 4, making sure all of the doors or windows have lever hardware that are easier to operate. And 5, of course, access to a washroom that makes sure that the toilet, sink, and the door are all accessible. Of course, if you were really planning ahead, then you're also thinking about washing. So do you need to have a tub? Can you quickly transition that out into a shower? In fact, there's a whole bunch of great information. So I always love giving people resources. There's a bunch of great information about visitable housing that was put together in Canada by a group called Visitable Housing Canada. Their group has since completed its funding, but the website is a legacy project and it gives you all kinds of great resources to be using. Now let's move on to the definition of adaptable housing. The idea of adaptable housing is this idea of planning ahead, right? So it's about being able to easily and affordably modify the house that you're designing and building in the first place. So if you don't make it accessible to begin with, how could you transition the housing as your needs change? Here we have at least six different things that you might be thinking about. One, the accessible modifications are easy to make to the house. Two, that your hallways and staircases are already wide and straight. There's a big cost to having a curved set of stairs. Three, thresholds that are flush, which means that, again, they're flat, again, I'm showing you the technical things, less than 6 millimeters in height or 1/4 of an inch. Number four, the doors are wider, and that means at least 950 wide to get larger equipment through, beneficial to lots of people. Five, floor plans are clear and free of obstructions. And six, your kitchens and bathrooms have enough clear floor space for mobility devices, and perhaps thinking about all of the storage space and the kitchens and counters you have as well. There's a great group of Canadians also working on co-housing. Canadian Co-Housing Network has a great website. This is a picture from their page that has a definition about co-housing, and they talk quite a bit about accessible and universal design housing as well. So if you're looking for another idea, that would be one I would point you to. So finally, the definition for universal design housing. We see here on the screen a quote that it creates housing that can work for everyone. It makes housing accessible to those with disabilities. It also lets people staying in their home as their circumstances change without extensive renovations. And because a well-designed accessible unit doesn't look different from a standard unit, it appeals to those who need special features, but also to those who don't. So there are 5 general principles you might find in a universal design house. Of course, there's many more details to this, but one, are you thinking about designing for taller and shorter people? The average height for the building code is 6 foot tall. Well, the average height for women in Canada is actually 5'4", and I'm just shy of that. Number 2, are you thinking about designing for both left and right-handed people? I bet you all the left-handed people here are thinking, you know what, they're definitely not designing for me. Number 3, those who are losing their hearing and our vision, dexterity, and stamina, they're concrete things we can do. Number 4, designing for children's needs, which are different from adults' needs, which are different from seniors' needs. If we keep that in mind in the preliminary part of the design, we can create housing that works for everybody. And then 5, simple things like color contrast, lever hardware, and the list goes on. So at the bottom of this page, I have a link to the CMHC website. If you can take a screenshot and grab this link. Otherwise, if you do a search for universal design with the CMHC website or with Google, it will take you to lots of great resources. Okay, so universal design is based on 7 principles. This is a picture that shows the 7 principles with cartoons. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll just quickly read the titles. First is equitable use. Second, flexibility in use. Third, simple and intuitive use. Fourth, perceptible information. Fifth, tolerance for error. Sixth, low physical effort. And 7th, size and space for approach and use. There's also 8 goals of universal design, what you may also hear about, and depending on your region, may be more popular, or this is sort of a leading trend in universal design, which focuses on 1, body fit, 2, comfort, 3, awareness, 4, understanding, 5, wellness, 6, social integration, 7, personalization, and 8, cultural appropriateness. So that's the difference between this one and the other one, is that this one focuses also or considers cultural appropriation or appropriateness. So finally, accessible housing is actually a specifically dedicated housing that's customized to the user's needs. It's not just about the housing though, right? One of the things we always learn about housing is location, location, location. So remember that whenever you're talking about accessible housing, there are at least 3 other things you have to be making sure you have access to. 1, access to transit, community services, shopping, education, employment, and many other services. 2, making sure that you have quality, choice, and affordability. Not all of the accessible units on one floor, but distributed throughout the building, giving people choice of view, side of the building, proximity to whatever facilities they want. Again, the idea of 100% means that you don't have to wait for the right unit. And then 3, thinking about age in place, or as we used to talk about with the Older Women's Network and the Accessible Housing Network, living in place, that we don't want to be warehoused out to some older people's community or older people housing. We want to be able to live in the places that we love. And here's a link to, or a picture of the page from the CMHC website that has, again, lots of information already pre-existing that's been actually around. Designable Environments was helping them at least 10 years ago with this, titled Accessible and Adaptable Housing, that has information on universal design, secondary suites, accessible housing by design, age in place, renovation for accessibility, and universal and adaptable housing models. So you can see real world examples. So number 5 on our agenda is, what are other places doing? And this is a really good news story, and it's going to end on a fabulous note. So first, the Fair Housing Act happened in the United States as a part of the Civil Rights Act. It happened in 1968. Despite having this, unfortunately, we still don't see as much housing as you might have expected, but we do see that it prohibits discrimination in financing, leasing, buying, or renting of housing. Discrimination is based on, of course, sex, race, color, national origin, religion, family status, and disability. So this was a significant conscious effort to try to ensure accessibility of housing. We also see that there's a US group called Better Living Design, which has been focusing on universal design, sort of launched out of the universal design movement. And they also have a website here. They're talking about how townhomes could be a part of the solution, but they can be quite troublesome because they can be very narrow and have lots of stairs to climb. So how would you overcome that in a planning process? They are pointing to their cost analysis, which indicates that planning ahead of time, starting from the very beginning, knowing that 100% of people need to have access at some point in their life, they're highlighting from their models that they show an increase of price of anything from nothing, 0% to up to 5%. And very much we see across the world that this number very much depends on the expertise or experience of the designers and builders. We also see in the UK, Habentag is an organization that has been working on accessible housing and independent lives. They provide services, and they are focused quite a bit on, as Kate was saying at the beginning, how accessible housing helps prevent falls, helps improve mental health and other kind of care costs. It avoids hospitalization and the lack of it increases stay in hospital. And then, of course, comparing the cost of one night in a hospital across the National Housing or Health Service, about $273, while a week of residential care would cost $550. So staying at home is a lot more affordable. In the UK, in New Zealand, they have an amazing program called LifeMark, which has different levels of accessibility in housing that rewards the developer. So the higher the level of accessibility they achieve, the more discounts they get, the more accommodation or benefits they get from the region and municipality. It's been so popular, a lot of people are demanding it, and many municipalities are now requiring it. So it's a very interesting model. But this is probably the best news of all. A group like the Accessible Housing Network, the coalition of people in Australia, led by the Centre for Universal Design Australia, started putting together information and pressure to the government to use a livable housing design guideline that had already been established. And they wrote a whole series of information, including what you see here on the screen about the costs and benefit of livable housing design, including answering questions like, what is livable housing standard and what are the costs and benefits of the livable housing standard. In fact, they were so successful that now the Australian National Building Code, here's the announcement from the Australian Network for Universal Design Housing, that they had success. They announced in April of 2021 that the building minister agreed to mandate that the livable housing design silver level standard is going to be required for all housing in their national building code. So there's some hiccups, some things happening. It says here on the bottom, there's still work to do, but this is a great success. It can be done and has been done. We can do it too. Number 6, I wanted to show you some examples of housing modifications in universal design. So here we see toilet accessibility. We see the floor plan on the right-hand side that includes a visitable bathroom. So this is accessible and visitable. You don't have to go into someone's private space to access it. And we see the picture on the left shows the toilet, the shower, and the sink with transfer space beside the toilet, transfer space beside the sink, knee space for the sink as well. And they used a sliding door so that there would be no door swing to impact the maneuvering space within. Oops, sorry. Here we see that there's, this is an existing plan of a multi-bedroom. There's 3 bedrooms here that has an accessible ensuite and a separate bathroom. But notice that the separate bathroom, which is probably more likely or more comfortable for visitors to use, was not designed to be accessible. Renovating this could cost you about $30,000. So not very good planning, but they did think about the accessibility of the master suite. Now, thinking about getting out into the balcony, if we're talking about apartments and condos, which are technically the same thing under the building code, getting that flush or no step entry, one of the biggest concerns has always been, what about the water? So what we see here is that what's called a trench drain that happens just on the outside of the door. And you can see that the deck or the original concrete is lower, and that would be normally the step. But they build up the deck with wood planking that's done to make sure it's flush. And then they put a grating over top that helps to drain the water away. Obviously, the joints between the planking as well drain the water as well too. But the drainage right by the door helps to prevent any flooding inside the unit. So we know how to do that. Kitchens, we see that there's on the right-hand side an old-fashioned kind of kitchen where you can have the knee space at a sink with cupboards that fold away and can close up so you don't have to see under the sink when you don't want to. On the left, we see a bright yellow kitchen that's height adjustable. So the upper cabinets can come down, the counter height can come up and down so you can serve standing users or taller users or shorter users or seated users. And then pantry cupboards that pull out from the edge to allow better access for more storage. Here we see another beautiful kitchen that has, again, an adjustable height counter, thinking about different users and the changing needs of users in their lifetime. We don't have to use traditional dishwashers. We now have drawer dishwashers that allow us to have side access or seated access or above access. You pull out the drawer, put in the dishes, run the dishwasher. Especially as the number of people changes in your house, these types of drawer dishwashers can be run more frequently and you're not getting rotten food. We also have drawer microwaves. So again, where do I put the microwave to keep it accessible? Where do I keep the controls to keep them accessible? It doesn't have to be on the counter if that's the concern, but if a normal microwave is put below the counter, as we see here, it becomes very difficult, challenging, and maybe even unsafe to operate. So you don't want to be putting it above, out of people's reach, but a drawer microwave might be a better solution. We also think about people's dignity, their respect, and ability to take care of themselves for longer simply by putting in an electrical plug near the toilet so that a toilet lift could be used. And grab bars don't have to look institutional, folks. These are 2 examples of beautiful grab bars that function the same way, but people don't have the same sort of institutional reaction to them. They can look like a beautiful part of your design. Here we see a washing machine and dryer with controls on the front. They're elevated so you don't have to bend down to try to access, make sure you didn't leave any socks behind. making sure your trash and recycling facilities are accessible, or things people often don't think about. We didn't see that in any of the legislation. And we can see here that the large bins can be lowered or semi-buried because the sides mean that the trucks can pick it up and fit it in. Of course, people love to have their gardenings. There's no reason that accessible gardening can't happen. Here we see a raised garden with knee space for a person using a motorized wheelchair. And here we see another garden that has accessible paths of travel, accessible surfaces, raised planters, and access throughout the garden. And finally, quickly, success stories. British Columbia has had adaptable housing in the Saanich Council since 2003. It includes many of the mandatory basic visitable features that we talked about, from the flush entry to the lever hardware to the toilets. And we see in Ottawa that people who are looking for green housing, they have a 42-unit accessible apartment building. So the entire apartment building, 100% accessible, only costs $27 a year to heat, so it works for everybody. We also see 2 other types of multi-faith housing initiatives that are also happening in Ottawa. One is a not-for-profit and the other is run by the MHI. We also have a set of units that are housing that has been built dedicated to this in Bridgewater. And the Daniels Corporation is hard at work creating their accessible design program that includes all the features we've been talking about. And Pickering has the first fully accessible condominium. I understand this has been paused because of the COVID. And back in 2001, so this can be done, we see a picture example here of 6 North apartments from St. Louis, Missouri. The color contrast between the doors and the walls, an adjustable height counter. The counters are color contrasted to the cabinetry. So that's it for me, but I wanted to leave you with some contact information for the Accessible Housing Network. You can reach them at accessibleHousingNetwork.org, on Twitter at AHN Today, or on their Facebook page at facebook.com/accessibleAHN. And then there's a Gmail account for accessibleHousingNetwork@gmail.com. If you would like to reach me or ask any questions, you can reach me at my work address at thea.curdy@designable.ca. I'm also posting vigorously on social media, and you can catch most of that on Twitter at @tcurdy. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back to Lynn now.
Unmute. Oh, thank you so much. That was amazing. What a lot of information to digest. That was wonderful. I want to thank all 3 of you, Kate, Tracy, Thea. And we do have time. As I said at the beginning, we're going to end around before 12:15. And if you'd like to put any questions at all in the chat, we may not be able to get to all of them, but we have Joy Silver, who is watching that function right now. And Joy is going to pull out some questions for Kate or for Tracy or for Thea.
So thank you, Lynn. And while people are hopefully composing some wonderings, what occurred, most of my questions that I wrote down have been answered beautifully by one of the 3 of you or all. One that comes to mind that has not been addressed but is probably included in your presentations is, are our Indigenous, Black and BIPOC people considered in all of these designs and addressing the mandates for accessible housing? Well, I just put that out there if any one of you would like to respond. Tracy, Thea, and Kate. Are those people in our community considered in all of these plans?
Hi, Joy, it's Thea. I'll try to tackle that, and then hopefully Tracy and Kate might be able to add to it. To my knowledge, there has not been a lot done. There are a lot of people talking about it. Certainly in urban planning, we often hear the conversation around what we call intersectionality, that far too often planners are thinking about putting us into boxes, right? I am a white woman who has vision loss, and you know, I have hearing loss. I have a learning disability with dyslexia. Sometimes my knees are bad and I can't walk upstairs. But that experience, and I'm an upper middle class person socioeconomically, and I'm Caucasian, that experience is going to be very different from, as you said, a person of color or a person, Indigenous person, a person who's transgender or gay. It has a very different experience. A person with vision loss who later in life starts to experience hearing loss and arthritis, or any of us as we get older, we might experience dementia. So our needs are constantly changing and evolving, and I think there's a lot of work to be done. But what I am hearing is that people are starting to talk about it. So on the policy side, I haven't heard much, but I think that we're making progress towards that. And through conversations like this, this is the kind of place where this can be advanced. So I'd really like to thank everybody who's been a part of organizing this event today.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone on the call. We're going to show you a quick slide as we get ready to leave with the details about our next event in March 26th on another topic. And we're going to turn over to Frances for some closing words and extinguishing our chalice. Are you ready, Frances?
Yes, I'm just, okay. Getting the chalice back for you to see. I'm sorry, I can't spot my light myself. That's one of the disadvantages of all this. So that's why I'm not doing that. And I'm just getting this. I extinguish this chalice with this blessing. May we all be safe. May we all be free from harm. May all bodies, vessels of spirit and soul, be treated as the gifts that they are. May we care for one another by making space for those who need more time, more help, or a different means of moving. And as we continue to imagine a world built on principles of universal divine, in the words of Helen Keller, be of good cheer. Do not think of today's failures, but of the success that may come tomorrow. You have set yourselves a difficult task, but you will succeed if you persevere, and you will find a joy in overcoming the obstacles. Remember, no effort that we make to attain something beautiful is ever lost. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. Thank you. Ellen, can you take off the spotlighting so we can all see ourselves for just one moment here as we wave goodbye?
Yeah, just hang on one sec. I have to find who is. I've got Thea and Lynn. Hang on.
Is the time each time, is it 1 o'clock or 2? Because
it could be different each time. We'll have all the information on the website and through registration, and we're going to do a way better job next time of
Yeah,
having
we got the
very
date
clear all the way
confused.
through. So thank you all. If you have any questions, like, please follow up with the Accessibility Housing Network with your questions and your offers of support. Thanks, everybody. We're signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Okay.